for me in this world. I hadn't gone to college yet, so he was all I knew. And then, when I was young and crazy, I was so in love, so in love. Ashley Simpson comes on. I was finishing high school, starting college away from my boyfriend. We talked on the phone a lot, so clearly smitten young maiden. And then Blue Cantrell comes up. I was beginning to mature, no longer innocent. I realized guys are all the same cheating Nazi bastards. I couldn't believe it. I was, looking through all these subject responses and hit upon this. I was like, wow, it's gold mine right there. Anyway, so we would like to know what's happening in the brains of people undergoing such experiences. And so what we do is people for whom we can elicit at least 30% of autobiographical memories using this method, we invite them to participate in an MRI version. And I'm just showing you the experimental design here using the statistical design matrix that we use to analyze the data. So each row here is a different regressor, and this bottom row here would be just the 30 seconds that a piece of music is playing. So each white bar corresponds to that 30-second excerpt, after which people make responses indicating how familiar, autobiographically salient, and pleasing was that excerpt they just heard. And so then based on those responses, we can go and create these additional variables for familiarity, autobiographical salience, and valence. So for example, this first song was familiar, but not memory evoking at all, and, only moderately pleasing, whereas the second song was familiar, highly memory evoking, and also very pleasing. Okay. And so what I'm going to show you now is the group data. I'm going to skip over that slide. Just basically we get auditory cortex in response to music playing. The blue regions are when people are making their responses. But if we now break it out by familiar, autobiographical, and pleasing, here in green are regions that respond more when the music is familiar. And the bottom line here is it's basically sensory motor areas. So a lot of premotor areas, auditory areas, cerebellum. So regions that are presumably engaged in that mental singing along with the music, that familiar music as it's playing. But then sort of critically for the hypothesis, we can look at what's going on in the medial prefrontal cortex, and we find that ventral regions are responding more when the music is pleasing, as might be expected. But then both ventral and dorsal regions are responding more as that music is more memory evoking, supporting this general idea. Okay, but these responses here are just for that whole 30 seconds of the music is playing. I completely threw away all the nuance of the dynamics of tonality, music moving around in tonal space that I've spent all this time talking about. So what happens if we actually now take this model of movement in tonal space and use it to analyze these data to identify again, brain regions that are following this movement while people listen to music and experience these memories. And so the way I like to think about this is that music is basically a soundtrack for the mental movie that's playing in your mind as you're experiencing that memory. Right? So the memory, it's not all there right at the moment, just for that 1 second, but actually unfolds over time. And so the music similarly is unfolding over time. And so the idea is if you can model now the structure of the soundtrack, then that might be able to serve as a pointer to that dynamic activity that's reflecting that re-experiencing of the memory. So the brain areas that are bringing together the thoughts, images, and emotions that are being experienced. So that model looks like this. We separately model the tonality tracking regressors for memory-evoking songs and non-memory-evoking songs. So each vertical column here represents one of those 30-second excerpts. And the main thing to appreciate here is that each of these little patterns is different, right? So this is what I mean by the signature of the piece of music and how it moves through tonal space. And so to make sure we're not getting false positives, we run permutation tests where we shuffle the order of all these guys. So we preserve the temporal finite structure, but we've now shuffled the order, and we ask, in which regions does the veridical model explain the data significantly better than 95% of the alternative models? And then look at this over the group of subjects. And we see that many brain areas now have show this tonality tracking activity, including the auditory cortex, premotor areas, the visual cortex gets in on the action here, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which is presumably tied to this structural integration of the sequence of musical elements. I say that in part based on a lot of the other neuroimaging of musical structure work. And then the more dorsolateral prefrontal areas, which in other types of studies have been associated with the sequencing together of episodic information. And then the medial prefrontal cortex here, which of course is important for autobiographical memory and emotion. And this is where we see by far the bulk of the tonality tracking. So what we can then do is we can now compare the amount of variance explained by the memory-evoking songs and the non-memory-evoking songs and compare that, so just with a simple ratio here indicated by the color code, and ask, is any given region biased or unbiased towards the memory-evoking music? And so, for example, the auditory activation is not as biased as, say, compared to now when you're in the medial prefrontal cortex, where that coupling with the music on that finer temporal time scale that's reflecting the dynamic movement in tonal space is heavily biased towards the memory evoking songs. So sort of the attempt now to couple that model with one of the experiences that people regard as a salient way of experiencing music. All right, so just to summarize, music moves about in tonal space. Through repeated listening to music, we implicitly learn about the probability structures that underlie tonal space. We can model music's movement in tonal space and identify brain areas that follow those movements, and then in turn support the various experiences that we have as we interact with the music. So I'd just like to acknowledge some colleagues, Barbara Tillman, a long-time collaborator, Tom Collins, a great postdoc who led the effort on that psych review paper, Fred Barrett, a graduate student in the lab who helped with a lot of these things also. Other collaborators on tonality tracking work, a number of individuals who helped with the autobiographical remembering work, and funding from the Templeton Advanced Research Program, from the Meta-Nexus Institute, and also for the modeling work was supported by the National Science Foundation. And thank you all for your attention.
We have lots of time for questions.
Ed.
So, my tonality, as I follow your work, what I think I see is that, the areas that are responding to tonality are responding more if a piece of music evokes an autobiographical memory, correct?
It's well, no, I mean not. Here, let me back up here. This is sorry. Let me just pull up this slide here. Right. So all these regions here are showing tonality tracking. Some of them are more biased toward do that more strongly when the memory music is memory evoking, right? So the quality of the coupling is better in those cases.
And that's mainly medial prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, and then also these dorsolateral prefrontal regions.
Which is what you found in the original tonality tracking stuff, right? The medial prefrontal cortex.
The medial prefrontal cortex. Albeit the over, so within individuals, I saw it throughout the medial prefrontal cortex. The one super consistent spot was actually a little more rostral and a little more ventral. Part of the reason it's not showing up here is because of susceptibility artifact and the fact that I don't have data there for all the subjects. So the way that that initial paper was done, it was just done in the space of every individual subject and high resolution and everything. So that accounts for part of the difference. There's actually another parts of that too, but
I guess my real question is, could you see something similar for, say, rhythm? So in other words, areas that tend to respond to musical rhythm, would there be areas that are more responsive to a song that you know, or that has an autobiographical memory?
No, absolutely. Well, as I pointed out before, it's not as though the tonality model is entirely devoid of rhythm, right? It's partly in there. You see the girl from Ipanema and it's doing this, right? And but if like your Heather Chapin's paper on expressive timing, okay, one of the activation loci is in fact here in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and then there's this paper by forgetting her first name, but Kornisheva, working with Ricardo Schubotz, where they were judging I think the aesthetic qualities or complexity of rhythms. And they also find activation of this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. So the way I would characterize this is that these areas, when you have this dynamic, time-varying, expressive structure, right, that's giving music so much of its richness, that any of those qualities, here's the way to look at it. If you're having music, in all these cases, it's a retrieval cue, or it's something you have to make, let's say, this aesthetic judgment about, or you're having to somehow integrate with some deeper experience of it. And so the music is having to touch on and interact with all these other mental representations where together those are all giving you that mental experience, okay? And so I just think that the medial prefrontal cortex here is one of those places where that interaction can happen. In particular, when you have these expressive stimuli or in models that capture those expressive aspects. Lisa.
How do you familiarity relate to the autobiographical memory? I mean, if you two were more familiar, did they have more autobiographical memories, or were they related?
In general, there's a correlation between familiarity and autobiographical memory, though it's not perfect, and in fact that's why we can dissociate some of these, dissociate the sort of the individual contributions. In this particular study, our familiarity rating was fairly coarse. It was just binary, is it familiar or not. Since then, we've moved towards 5-point scales for that.
Okay, because I was wondering if there might be lingering behind that autobiographical memory variable, just familiarity, and that the changes had to do with familiarity rather than necessarily.
Yeah, well, so in this particular case where we're just analyzing the whole epoch and can sort of separate them, and we see that here in this region in yellow here, that's actually, there's an independent effect of familiarity and then an additional effect of that autobiographical salience. In terms of the tonality tracking, you can kind of set up a different model where you're just doing familiar, unfamiliar, and the patterns change around a little bit. Unfortunately, don't have that right here to show. Anyway, it requires a little bit more exploration. Yes, Scott?
Yeah, Peter, on that first key changing experiment, I'm afraid I've lost track. Were you tracking absolute pitch, absolute key, as they move slowly through all the keys?
Yeah, so, it was. The model was one of absolute keys. So what I didn't point out when I mentioned it in the talk is each of these things now shows the activation pattern on the torus sort of averaged over the 16 seconds that the melody was unambiguously in each key. And so here you have those distributions. But yeah, the model was in terms of the absolute movement through the
because that bears on the old question in music of why some people have absolute pitch, and yet most people don't. Yet those of us who don't really have a good memory for the pitch of things we know.
Yeah. Well,
the Star Spangled Banner in a new key, even a step higher, most people would say it seems higher.
That's right, and there's actually an excellent study in Psych Science by Glenn Schellenberg and Sandra Treehub that assessed just that. They took familiar TV theme songs and then transposed them by 1 or 2 semitones, either up or down, and then gave people a forced choice task, which was the original, and showed that your standard listener can reliably identify the original, indicating that if you're probing the presence of absolute pitch memory in that sense, in an appropriate manner, that in fact more people have absolute pitch than would be gauged by traditional label the note measure.
Manfred Clance once told me he found something more surprising. If he took his mother's voice from the telephone and used pitch shifting, so you kept the time structure but shifted the pitch, even a half step, you couldn't tell it was his mother until the prosody came through and he could recognize his mother's prosody. But so it's really quite striking how much you do remember, associate absolute pitch with specific memories.
Yeah. Ed.
Actually, that's a really interesting point. It brings up an interesting question. If you were to do that sort of transposition by just 1 or 2 steps of these stimuli, these familiar and autobiographical stimuli, how do you think that would change the results?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something to try. I think you'd still largely. I still think you'd still recognize it as the song, and that it would still activate the representations and the associated memories, and so I think you'd still pretty much see the same result. But it's an important point. Does it have to be the absolute representation, or is it something else? And it actually bears on this initial study too, which you know, I mean, it went into this with the objective of, you know, actually seeing the torus nicely laid out in the brain, and they'd be consistently there across scanning sessions and everything like that. And that didn't happen, right? So if you, within each subject, if you ask, if for any given voxel, was that responsive to the same key region in each session, i.e. was there an absolute mapping? The answer was no. And that was even true. We had 2 absolute pitch listeners in this group, and even in that case, the region of maximal sensitivity was different, right? So what, I mean, the way I sort of thought about it since, and if you think about what the tonality tracking model is doing, it's, you know, it has this particular temporal structure to it. And at the end of the day, in the statistical models, what you're doing is you're comparing the temporal structure in the model with the temporal structure in your physiological signal, and asking, is there a significant correlation between those temporal structures? And so, you know, if you take a piece of music, you put in a different key, sure, you know, absolutely it's different, but the quality of all the harmonic transitions and, you know, the abruptness or smoothness of any given transition, that stays the same. And so if the model, you know, if we're able to explain the behavioral data essentially by variables that are indicating what's the moment-to-moment change in perceived, you know, tonal fit, goodness of